Hey guys! Tonight we tiptoe into powdered parlors, shadowy hallways, and long-forgotten boudoirs where mirrors weren't just furniture, they were feared. You're standing in a Georgian bedroom right now. The wallpaper is damp with age, the wood floors creak like old joints, and across the room sits a tall mirror, gilded in gold leaf, its surface barely catching the candlelight, and for some reason, you feel like it's looking back. You probably won't survive this, with your self-esteem intact, at least. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your location and what time it is where you are. I love knowing where in the world you're drifting off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The air is thick with perfume and powder. You shuffle across a carpet that's seen too many slippers toward that large mirror. It's Georgian, oval-shaped, the kind that rests on a carved mahogany frame, almost human size. You could step into it if you were brave enough, but tonight you're not here to step in. You're just here to observe. Let's be clear, mirrors weren't always household staples. In the early 1700s, owning a proper silvered glass mirror was a sign of ridiculous wealth. Not the fun kind of ridiculous, the kind where you paid a man in Venice to blow hot glass over his own beard sweat and then carry it to England on a mule. Naturally, these pieces developed reputations. If your mirror costs more than your estate, it might as well have a soul of its own. By the mid-18th century, London's elite women had whole dressing rooms, called toilettes, built around mirrors. These weren't just for powdering your nose, these were ritual spaces, complete with servants, tea, and awkward small talk. But what no one liked to mention aloud was what sometimes happened during those late-night rituals, when the candles burned lower than expected, when the room felt unusually cold, when, just for a second, you noticed your reflection didn't quite keep up. There's a rumor, well, several actually, but one in particular that traces back to 1744. A lady's maid named Honor Kneeling claimed that while brushing her mistress's hair after midnight, the mirror refused to show the back of her head. It showed her own hands, sure, the chair, even the wig stand, but not her mistress's face. That part was missing. The story gets more unsettling. Her mistress, Lady Frances Blythe, died of an apoplectic fit 3 days later. She was 29. Historians still argue whether Lady Blythe actually died or simply faked her death to avoid debt collectors, something more common than you'd think. But that's not the part people remember. They remember Honor's sworn affidavit, and her trembling fingers, and the fact that she never brushed anyone's hair again. In polite society, you weren't supposed to acknowledge superstition, but the truth was, mirrors made people uneasy. The science was just beginning to catch up, and even the most educated minds were unsure what these reflecting panes really did. Some said they worked by bouncing light particles. Others thought they simply peeled back a layer of reality, and a small, quieter camp believed mirrors didn't reflect at all. They remembered. You pace slowly across the bedroom. There's something about these floorboards. They have a rhythm, as if they've memorized the weight of 1,000 nighttime steps. You stop in front of the mirror. You're not wearing a corset, of course, but if you were, you'd feel it tighten with unease. Your reflection is exactly where it should be. But isn't it odd how your eyes seem just a little out of sync? Just a millisecond? Here's something else no one tells you. Georgian mirror makers used a thin layer of silver nitrate or mercury behind the glass. These substances were poisonous, especially when they began to break down. Ladies who sat before their mirrors for too long, often with chipping paint and poor ventilation, might suffer from hallucinations, dizziness, and vivid nightmares. But you try telling a duchess that her haunted looking glass is just mild mercury poisoning. You'd be laughed right out of court. And yet, even with that science, some tales defy neat explanations. There's the case of the Marchioness of Grenville, who insisted her mirror whispered her name every night after her husband's funeral, or the clergyman who smashed a parlor mirror after it showed him a second, rotting version of his own face. The shards? They bled, or maybe he just cut himself. No one checked. In most of these tales, the pattern is clear. Everything happens after midnight. You can almost feel the shift yourself. As the hour creeps past 12, the very shape of the mirror seems to change. The edges darken. The glass bends light in strange ways. Even the dust motes seem to dance slower. You sit now in the corner chair. The upholstery is fraying, brocade, with just a hint of lavender-scented mildew. The mirror looms across from you still. You'd swear the air is cooler, not cold, just unsettled. If you squint, you might see a faint handprint near the bottom of the glass. A child's, maybe a maid's, or perhaps it's yours from earlier. Here's a final thought for this stretch of night. Georgian parents sometimes covered mirrors in their children's rooms after dark, not because of superstition, they claimed, but to prevent overstimulation. The mirrors, they said, might distract young minds, but if you ask the children, those few who wrote about it later in life, they all said the same thing. The mirrors moved, just a little, just enough to know they were awake. You lean back a little, still in that fraying chair, and now the candlelight is softer, casting long arms of gold across the floorboards. Your eyes drift back toward the mirror. It hasn't moved. Of course it hasn't. And yet, if you stared long enough, you might catch the flicker, the slightest quiver of something not you moving behind the glass. Welcome to the Georgian beauty ritual, where fashion meets full-blown paranoia. Imagine yourself in 1760, corset laced within an inch of your ribcage, face powdered so white your skin looks moth-bitten. You're seated at your toilette. That's not a bathroom, by the way. It's your elaborate dressing table. A polished mahogany surface, tiny drawers for rouge and arsenic-based face powder, silver combs, velvet-lined boxes, and front and center, a large mirror flanked by 2 brass candlesticks. Those candlesticks are key. Most Georgian homes still relied on candlelight after sunset. Candles flicker, shadows waver. The combination of reflective glass and unstable flame meant reflections were never quite still. Ladies reported seeing their mirror selves blink out of sync, turn their heads independently, or even smile when they themselves did not. Were they sleep-deprived? Maybe. Dramatic? Absolutely. But the stories stacked up like perfume bottles on the edge of the vanity. Historians still argue whether this was early optical illusion theory in action, or simply the result of women spending far too much time staring into unreliable, warping glass. Early Georgian mirrors were notorious for having slight imperfections. A wave in the glass, a small ripple in the silvering, just enough to give your reflection a ghost of a second face. But it didn't help that the mirrors were often angled. Yes, believe it or not, fashion dictated that mirrors be tilted slightly upward, so one could see their entire profile while seated. The result? Distorted reflections, especially when viewed from the side or periphery. It was like catching a stranger out of the corner of your eye, except the stranger had your hair. Here's something fringe. A pamphlet circulated briefly in 1759 titled The Reflected Eve, Vanity's Undoing. It warned that excessive use of mirrors could invite mirrored spirits into the home. The author, anonymous of course, claimed that a mirror left uncovered during a thunderstorm could absorb excess air spirits and then leak them out during moments of weakness. That's a lovely thought to file away before bed. You glance back at the mirror again. That smudge in the corner looks suspiciously like a nose print. Yours? Someone else's? Powdering was a full contact sport in Georgian England. Women would spend hours painting their faces with mixtures of lead, vinegar, and even crushed pearls. The thick paste, known affectionately as white lead, was intended to smooth the complexion and scream, "I've never seen sunlight in my life." Ironically, it slowly poisoned them, caused hair loss, and gave their skin a translucent, haunting pallor. Combine that with the flickering candlelight, and no wonder their reflections looked undead. Even more entertaining or horrifying, the application of beauty patches, tiny velvet or silk shapes, stars, moons, hearts, were glued to the face to hide blemishes or send social signals. A patch near the mouth meant flirtatiousness. Near the right cheek, married. Near the left cheek, maybe single. Near both, best not to ask. Now picture applying all this in front of a slightly warped mirror, lit by a single candle, after midnight, while your maid keeps glancing nervously at the door. You'd feel a little haunted too. Some noble households even had servants assigned to sit in the dressing room during evening preparations solely to keep the air clear. The idea was that mirrors might become too active in a silent room. Laughter, casual chatter, even the clinking of teacups. These were thought to settle the mood and perhaps confuse anything that might try to come through. Still, women occasionally reported odd occurrences. One dowager countess swore that her mirror reflected a young man in a red coat who wasn't in the room. Another said her reflection continued brushing her hair after she'd put the brush down. And, in one particularly unnerving tale, a young bride insisted she saw her own funeral in the mirror 3 nights before she died of an unexplained fever. But, don't worry, you're not using any lead makeup tonight. Probably. Some scholars try to dismiss these mirror stories as hysteria, another term tossed at women like confetti during the period. But others suggest something deeper, that the act of staring into a mirror, alone, in silence, surrounded by symbols of vanity and pressure and performance, could lead anyone to feel detached, disoriented, maybe even like the person in the mirror wasn't quite you anymore. There's an older superstition too, from before the Georgian period, that lingers like a perfume you can't scrub off, the mirror as soul catcher. If you died in front of a mirror, it might trap your spirit. That's why mirrors were often covered after a death in the household, so the soul could escape cleanly. But in the Georgian era, that practice took on a classier spin. Instead of draping black cloth, some noble families had mechanical mirror covers built into their furniture. At night, a panel would swing closed automatically. Polite, discreet, supernatural insurance. You stare a little longer at the mirror now. The flame is steady. Your reflection seems cooperative, but wasn't your left eyebrow just a bit more raised than you meant it to be? Just now, you blink. Everything's fine, right? You exhale slowly, keeping your eyes on that mirror as if daring it to twitch. Nothing does. The room is quiet, the kind of thick velvet quiet that wraps itself around you and muffles everything, even your thoughts. And then a whisper, barely audible, barely real, echoes in your memory. Not from outside, not from the room, from something told to you long ago, or maybe just moments ago. Something about what mirrors trap. You shuffle a little closer, floorboards moaning in their old age. Georgian ladies knew better than to gaze into a mirror alone after midnight. They didn't always say why, but their servants did, especially the maids, the women who brushed hair, changed linen, carried gossip like teacups from room to room, and they spoke in the language of candlelit fear. You never stare into a mirror after the last bell, a Yorkshire maid once whispered to a girl in service. Not if you want to see your own eyes tomorrow. You think she was exaggerating? Maybe. But these warnings came up again and again, in whispered exchanges behind closed doors, in casual comments meant as jokes, but always delivered too quickly. Maids knew things mistresses never heard or refused to hear. A popular tale in Bath's servant circles involved a footman who dared look into the lady's long mirror after everyone else had retired. He grinned at his reflection, smoothed his waistcoat, and then watched in horror as his reflection didn't smile back. The story says he screamed once, short and sharp. They found him curled under the vanity, gibbering nonsense about his mirror self, whispering secrets that weren't his to know. Historians still argue whether these were just urban legends or examples of class anxiety turned theatrical. But there's something about the consistency of the fear, always after midnight, always involving a lone figure and a reflective surface, that makes you wonder if they were describing the same phenomenon without realizing it. Some servants even developed specific mirror superstitions. One rule claimed you must never clean a mirror with your bare hands. You had to wear gloves or else risk smudging the sole side of the glass. Another said that humming while dusting a mirror would distract anything listening, because of course silence was an invitation. And then there's the story of Mary Hillcomb, a 16-year-old maid in a home outside of Dover. In 1773, she was caught sitting in front of the drawing room mirror late at night, talking quietly to her reflection. The butler, passing by on his way to the kitchens, reported that she was asking it questions, pausing for answers, smiling. They dismissed it as fatigue until she fell into a fever 2 days later, screaming about being pulled through the glass. She survived, but lost her speech for the rest of her life. She worked in silence after that, and if someone so much as brushed past a mirror in her presence, she would flinch hard enough to drop a tray. You inch away from your own reflection now, not out of fear, you tell yourself, but because the candle is getting low and your neck's a bit stiff. But still, there's that pull, the kind that asks, what if you just watched a little longer? What if you stared until the silence broke? In Georgian times, superstition filled the cracks that science hadn't quite reached. One belief among the lower classes was that mirrors had an appetite. They fed on attention, on time. The more you gave them, the more they took. Vanity, in this case, wasn't just sin, it was a transaction. You gave the mirror your gaze, and maybe, just maybe, it kept a little peace. Even the wealthy weren't immune. Some noble ladies had screens designed to slide in front of mirrors at night. It was never explained directly, not even in diaries, but you find entries like, had the glass veiled after mother's turn, no dreams since, or avoided my own eyes tonight, better to sleep. Better to sleep. Here's a fringe gem for you. An old superstition held that a mirror could remember your secrets. If you confessed something terrible while looking into one, it would hold that knowledge forever. And that's why some women only did their deepest thinking away from the mirror. Because what if it told someone or showed someone? You walk now, slowly, toward the hallway, just beyond the bedroom. There's a smaller mirror mounted there, a decorative one, oval shape, meant more for glancing than grooming. But even that one feels like it's waiting, slightly tilted, slightly darker than the others. Back in 1767, at a manor in Sussex, a stable hand claimed to see a different corridor reflected in one of these decorative mirrors, not the one behind him, but one entirely unfamiliar, candles where there were none, walls with wallpaper no one had ever chosen. He thought he imagined it until he told the cook, who turned pale and said she'd seen the same thing years before. They removed the mirror a week later, not because anyone was harmed, but because no one could stop looking. Some say the superstition about not covering mirrors wasn't just about ghosts, it was about obsession. The Georgian era had a complex relationship with identity. To stare too long at your reflection was considered unseemly. Vain, yes, but also risky. Because what if the person you saw wasn't you anymore? You return now to the bedroom. The large mirror sits quietly, dust clinging to its corners like old gossip. The candle is lower, casting more shadow than light, and yet your reflection stays in place. It follows you, as it should, but still, you're aware of it now. The stories, the warnings, the invisible rules passed down not in books, but in sideways glances and unfinished sentences. One last murmur before you rest. Some believe that if you stared into a mirror for too long after midnight, your reflection would begin to feel real, independent, and once it noticed you, once it realized it was being watched, it might just choose not to leave. So maybe tonight, don't linger. You turn from the mirror now, slowly, not wanting to break eye contact too quickly, because there's still that old instinct, buried somewhere primal, that says don't show your back to a watcher. And what is a mirror if not a silent watcher that never blinks? The Georgian aristocracy, for all their powdered wigs and salon chatter, were just as wary, maybe more so, because the more mirrors you had, the more eyes you collected. Step into a grand Georgian estate, not just the bedroom, but the drawing rooms, the parlors, the stair landings, and you'll find mirrors everywhere, gilded, carved, framed like miniature altars, and that's exactly what they were. Altars to appearance, to elegance, to social armor. But the more mirrors, the more shadows, the more angles, the more places to catch something moving that shouldn't be moving. And that's where the fear deepened. It wasn't just any mirror that earned whispers after midnight. It was the big ones, the overmantels, the hall-length glass in the grand vestibule. These were the so-called threshold mirrors, the ones tall enough to reflect your entire body, and supposedly your spirit along with it. One tale, often repeated among the more dramatic of Georgian ladies, and there were many, involved a certain mirror in a Norfolk manor. At precisely 1 in the morning, if you stood alone before it, the legend claimed your reflection would gain a guest, a tall figure in gray, just over your shoulder, visible only in the glass. It never moved, it just appeared, stood there, until you looked away, and when you looked back, nothing. But some women said they could still feel it behind them, long after leaving the room. Historians still argue whether this tale originated with a real piece of furniture, or if it was simply born from the classic cocktail of moonlight, opium tonics, and overactive imaginations. But one thing is clear, these stories weren't confined to the lower classes. The fear touched silk and lace just as easily as soot and starch, and some women took it seriously. Wealthy households often hired mirror makers to craft their glass in particular ways, not just for beauty, but for peace of mind. You might request a beveled edge to break the gaze, or a darker silver backing to keep the reflection dimmer, more discreet. In one particularly delicious example from 1781, Lady Bransley of Devon ordered all mirrors in her estate to be tinted in rose, as she believed this dulled the reflection's appetite. Reflection's appetite. That's one way to phrase it. Here's a lesser-known tidbit. Some ladies kept tiny paper charms behind their mirrors, tucked just inside the frame. These were folded triangles, inked with prayers or symbols, sometimes even hair. Most of these were quietly removed by maids when the mirrors were clean, but occasionally one would fall out, and panic would ripple through the house. Not because it was embarrassing, but because the charm had fallen, as if protection had slipped. You walk now through an imagined hallway, echoing with the clipped heels of a Georgian lady. Let's say Miss Eliza Towbridge. She's returning from a card party, cheeks flushed with wine and candle smoke. She catches sight of herself in the long hall mirror and pauses, not out of vanity, but because something's off. Her earrings glint, yes, her smile is there, but the folds of her gown, there's a delay, a half-second hiccup, a ripple in the silk behind the glass that doesn't match the one in front of it. She blinks. The image steadies. Perhaps it was the wine. Perhaps it was the way her candle guttered. Perhaps. But she does not pass that mirror again without a shawl over her head. Some said mirrors after midnight were thin places. Portals, in a sense, not to another world, but to another version of this one. One where the light moved wrong, and the air didn't quite match the warmth of your skin. You could glimpse it briefly if the room was quiet enough, if your heart beat a little faster, if your name had been spoken just before you entered. And that idea, the mirror as not just a reflection, but a version, that's what gave the fear its sharpest edge. What if the mirror wasn't broken? What if it was right, and you were the distorted one? By 1790, a few thinkers tried to rationalize the fears with science. One physician, Dr. Wexley Trentham, wrote a short treatise titled Reflected Duplicity. nervous disorders, and the looking glass. In it, he blamed all mirror-related panic on fatigue, nervous temperament, and overuse of eye focus during nocturnal hours, which is a wordy way of saying, stop looking so hard when you're sleepy. And yet, buried at the end of the text, almost like a footnote, he includes a case study, an unnamed woman who claimed her reflection aged a day ahead of her own face. She noticed it first in the lines near her mouth, then the gray near her temples, and by the time her reflection smiled with a missing tooth, she locked the mirror away and never used one again. Of course, the rational explanation is simple: imagination, lighting, nerves. But the Georgians didn't always want the rationale. That wasn't the point. The point was safety. That's why certain rules developed, some spoken, some not. Never face a mirror directly if you're alone and awake after the second bell. Never leave a mirror uncovered if someone in the house is ill. And, perhaps strangest of all, never speak your own name into a mirror after midnight. Why? Because it's polite not to wake whatever's listening. So here you are, in your own space, far from powdered wigs and peach-colored wallpaper, and yet, the rules still tap gently on the edge of your mind. They traveled, quietly, like whispers sewn into lace. You glance once more at the mirror. Nothing unusual, but just in case, don't say your name. Not yet. You retreat now, careful not to look back, because turning around to check, just to see if the mirror has changed, is the kind of thing that only works in movies. In Georgian England, it was seen as dangerous, not dramatic, just tempting fate. And fate back then wore a powdered face and a corseted waist, and it didn't play nice after midnight. Let's wander now into a different kind of room, one that doesn't get much attention during the day, the dressing chamber. Modest by modern standards, but in the 18th century this was a sacred space, a private world. Here, the lady of the house would prepare herself each morning, hair drawn high, cheeks lightly rouged, hands perfumed with rose water, and each night she would unmake herself, layer by layer, beneath the quiet stare of the mirror. But here's the thing, she never did this entirely alone. There was always the maid, and sometimes the mirror, and sometimes, late at night, it felt like the mirror was more present than the maid. Some ladies swore they saw things while combing their hair. Not faces, not shadows, just flickers. A different wallpaper in the reflection. An object sitting on the vanity that didn't exist in the room. One time, a woman claimed she saw a birdcage behind her, one that had been sold years before. Historians still argue whether these were tricks of the mind or signs of hypnagogic states triggered by oil lamp fumes and tightly bound corsets. Others whisper about something else, that mirrors held residue, a memory, not just of the room, but of everything said, done, and revealed before it. Some even believe mirrors had to cool off after witnessing emotionally charged scenes. That's why, in certain houses, the maids covered dressing mirrors not only when someone died, but also after arguments, or childbirth, or long nights of weeping. It wasn't to block ghosts, it was to give the mirror time to forget. That's a strange kind of empathy, isn't it? Feeling sorry for a mirror. But Georgian women were taught to treat their reflections delicately. Never stare too long, never laugh too loudly in front of one, and never, ever cry at it. Tears, they said, could blur the barrier, make things leak through. There's a story from 1784 about Lady Meredith Tamsley, a widow of 37, with more rings than friends. She was said to be extremely fond of her dressing mirror, which had belonged to her late husband. Every night she sat before it, brushing her hair exactly 100 times, counting out loud, but one night she stopped at 97. Her maid, standing just outside the door, heard the silence stretch, and then Meredith whispered, "Don't," to no one. The next morning, she had faint scratches on her left cheek. She told the doctor it was her cat. She didn't own a cat. Even the architecture of Georgian houses reflects this careful relationship with mirrors. Long corridors often had no reflective surfaces. Mirrors were reserved for open spaces, drawing rooms, ballrooms, and dressing areas, but rarely placed opposite beds. That wasn't by accident. There was an unspoken understanding that mirrors should not be the last thing you see before sleep. One quirkier belief? That mirrors could listen, not with ears, of course, but with glass. The idea was that anything said directly to your reflection would echo, not acoustically, but spiritually. That's why lovers sometimes avoided professing feelings near mirrors, because a broken heart, once reflected, might stay. A fringe tidbit from rural Kent. One superstitious housekeeper insisted that broken mirrors had to be buried, not tossed, not recycled, buried, preferably at a crossroads, with salt and rosemary, because you don't throw away a witness, she said. That one made it into her parish's oral lore, and has been cited ever since as one of the odder burial rituals of 18th century domestic life. You glance now at the small mirror on your own vanity. It's just sitting there, still, harmless, and yet you feel the tiniest urge to turn it away, tilt it down, or, better yet, cover it, just for the night. Not because you believe it will show anything, but because, why give it the chance? In Georgian circles, superstition wasn't always about belief. It was about ritual, habit. You didn't cover the mirror because you knew something waited inside. You did it because someone else might believe, and you didn't want to be the reason their fear came true. There's something oddly generous about that. Another tradition worth mentioning, wedding preparations. Brides were told not to look into a mirror in full wedding attire. It would steal the marriage. So they'd put on everything but one shoe or leave off a glove until the last moment. Only once the ceremony was finished could she gaze fully at her reflection. You wonder how many brides peeked anyway. You're tired now, aren't you? The room seems a little quieter. The fan hums. The lights are low, but still, your mind drifts. Back to Lady Tamsley's whispered, "Don't." Back to the stories you dismissed as decoration, now feeling closer, less theatrical. The mirror isn't doing anything wrong. It's just sitting there, being a mirror. But here's the softest rule of all, one rarely spoken aloud. If a mirror makes you feel like you're not alone, believe it. Not forever, not logically, just long enough to slide a scarf over the glass and wish it good night. Because in the end, it's not about fear, it's about respect. And respect, especially after midnight, is what keeps the air quiet and the reflection calm. You're resting your eyes now, letting the thoughts slow, letting the stillness settle in your chest. But the story continues, as it always does, gliding deeper into the folds of a time where lace rustled louder than footsteps, and the candlelight played tricks that no one dared to question. Now, the ballroom, bright, echoing, filled with the scent of wax and lavender, its mirrors vast and gleaming like still ponds stretched against the walls. This was where Georgian society danced and glittered, where laughter echoed and fans snapped open with practiced grace. But under all that light and music, there was another layer, a subtle, silvery unease, because ballrooms had mirrors for more than just vanity. They were meant to double the light, to reflect wealth and stature, to make the room appear infinite. But by night's end, when the orchestra had gone quiet and the last slippers scuffed across polished floors, those same mirrors reflected something very different. The empty chairs, the extinguished chandeliers, the ghost of movement where there should be none. It was during these twilight hours that the servants moved through the mirrored rooms the most, cleaning, straightening, making the place look untouched for the next event. And they told the best stories, often in hushed tones while polishing gilt frames. One maid, Elsbeth, reportedly quit her post after catching sight of a couple dancing in the glass. The music had stopped hours earlier. There was no one else in the room, but she described the scene in detail. The woman's gown was unfashionable, the man wore a mask, and neither cast a shadow outside the reflection. When she turned around, the floor behind her was empty. Now, skeptics might say she was tired, hungry, drunk even, but Elsbeth swore to her grave that the mirror showed her something real. Historians still argue, whether these stories originated with early trauma, perhaps the leftovers of plague years or lost family members. Some suggest mirror visions were simply the mind trying to fill empty space with pattern and movement. But even the skeptical Georgian elite made small allowances. A mirror that felt off would be rehung. A ballroom that echoed too strangely might be closed for a season. Sometimes, they'd simply draw the curtains across the mirror, not for dust, but for modesty. You see, in Georgian thought, modesty extended to the very air in a room. Mirrors were said to absorb excess emotion, too much flirtation, too much grief, too much music, and the mirror would start to remember. And once it remembered, it could show things not quite in step with the moment. That's why grand mirrors, especially in old family estates, were often retired, not sold. No one would buy a used looking glass without inspecting its history. Instead, they were moved to unused rooms, attic halls, or storage wings, left to gather dust, covered, forgotten, but not destroyed. Because you don't destroy a mirror, not if you respect the house. Let's drift now to a real example. The Wexley Estate in Hampshire. In 1795, during a midsummer ball, the entire east wall of mirrors was curtained halfway through the evening. No announcement, no explanation, just quiet instruction passed from hostess to butler, from butler to footman, and then, shh, the velvet dropped. Some guests whispered about a girl who'd seen herself blinking on a delay. Others claimed a pair of eyes remained open behind her when she closed hers. No one could agree, but everyone agreed on one thing. Once the mirrors were covered, the dancing resumed with much more enthusiasm. Even now, the Wexley mirrors remain in storage, their frames intact, their glass unbroken. They've never been rehung. Fringe detail for you. There was once a short-lived fashion trend of placing pocket mirrors on gloves, a reflective button sewn into the wrist, meant to be flirtatious, mysterious, stylish. It didn't last. Too many ladies reported feeling watched when they looked down at their own hands. One even claimed she saw a different face entirely, just for a second. After that, the trend vanished. You stretch a little now, muscles softening, and in this warm quiet, you can almost hear the clink of a wine glass, the distant shuffle of silk shoes on floorboards, echoes perhaps of something that once was, or just your brain filing memories in candlelight. In all these stories, a pattern begins to form, not of ghosts or ghouls, but of repetition, the same flickers, the same whispers, the same sense that what you see in a mirror is nearly right, but not quite. And that not quite is what kept ladies awake at night. Not demons, not curses, just the possibility that reality had seams, and the mirror was where they showed. Georgian culture prized appearances, but even appearances had rules, and the unspoken rule of mirrors was this: they are your twin, not your friend. You treat them with care, you let them reflect your surface, but never your secrets. Which is why, even in rooms filled with people, a woman could pause at her reflection and feel alone. Or worse, feel like she was the reflection, just part of the illusion. And here's the joke. Light as lace and just as cutting, a Georgian lady would never admit aloud to fearing her own mirror, but she'd still make sure it was turned to face the wall before she went to bed. You blink now, slow and content. The images behind your eyes, a swirl of candlelit dance floors and rooms draped in velvet. And somewhere in that imagined house, a mirror waits, quiet, still, remembering. But not for long, because someone will cover it, as they always do, just in case. You don't quite notice the shift at first. It's subtle, like the way warm tea cools in your hand without you realizing. The story slows, thickens, and we descend from glittering ballrooms into something smaller, quieter, a hallway perhaps, a nursery, somewhere no one expects mirrors to matter. But they did. You might imagine a child's bedroom in Georgian England as a modest space, bare walls, simple toys, a crib in the corner. But in wealthy homes, Even the nursery had a sense of performance. The children wore miniature versions of adult clothing, were taught early how to sit properly, speak softly, bow, curtsy. And yes, sometimes their rooms had mirrors, not for vanity, for observation. You see, mirrors in nurseries were said to help a child become aware of themselves, a fashionable idea at the time, tied loosely to Enlightenment philosophy. Let them gaze at their own faces, parents said. Let them learn to recognize their behavior. But that wasn't the only reason. Nannies, often older women with strong opinions, had their own thoughts. Many believed mirrors should be covered when a baby cried, that the child's distress, reflected too clearly, could stick to the glass. Some even claimed that if an infant saw their own tears, it could cause night terrors later. One nanny reportedly scolded a new mother for feeding her baby in front of a mirror. You'll confuse the child. 2 mothers is too many. It's funny, isn't it, that in a time so concerned with discipline and structure, people still worried about reflections having feelings. There's a diary entry from 1769 written by a governess in Sussex. She notes a peculiar incident. The toddler under her care refused to nap unless the mirror was covered with a blue shawl. Any other color wouldn't do, just blue. When asked why, the child whispered, "Because the girl in the glass doesn't like it bright." Historians still argue whether children in these stories were simply mimicking adult fears or whether they tapped into something less filtered, something adults learn to ignore. There's ongoing debate about how children perceive space, emotion, and especially the presence of another self within reflective surfaces. Of course, it wasn't all eerie. Sometimes, the mirror was seen as a friend. Girls growing up in Georgian manors often confessed secrets to their reflections. First crushes, scandalous dreams, plans to steal extra cake from the kitchen. It became a kind of diary, silent, patient, and always there. But even these whispered moments were tinged with caution. Mothers warned their daughters not to speak too long to their reflections. You'll start believing it talks back, they'd say. One apocryphal tale tells of a 13-year-old who spent hours every afternoon in front of the same small mirror, lips moving silently. No one knew what she said. One day, she locked the door. When they finally entered, the mirror was shattered and she was gone. Run away to sea, it turned out. She became a sailor's bride and never spoke of the mirror again. Fringe belief time. Some households actually rotated mirrors during thunderstorms, turned them to the wall, or covered them with damp cloths. The reason? To ground the lightning. They believed a charged storm could activate the energy stored in reflective glass. Total nonsense, probably. But Georgian weather lore is endlessly entertaining. You wonder, idly, how many mirrors you've passed in your life without truly noticing. In stores, elevators, hotel lobbies, none of them felt wrong, but you still remember the one that did. Everyone has one. The mirror that gave them pause, a second too slow to reflect, a flicker of light that shouldn't be there. Maybe it was just your imagination, or maybe, as Georgian caretakers quietly feared, some mirrors were more awake than others. It was said that the best mirrors were obedient, reflective, subtle, but once a mirror started behaving independently, once it became dramatic, you got rid of it, or at least moved it out of the nursery. Let's drift for a moment to an odd little case. The Green Parlor incident of 1771. In a home near Bristol, a child claimed her mirror had become wet, but when the parents checked, it was dry. The girl insisted it was dripping from the inside. Soon after, her older brother began having nightmares. Always the same, a girl with no eyes, standing just behind his shoulder in the mirror. Naturally, the mirror was removed, sent to the attic, covered. But here's the quirky part. Years later, a distant relative moved in and had the glass recut into a hand mirror. She used it for 5 months before smashing it against a dresser. Her reason? It didn't blink when I did. Coincidence? Or a family heirloom with a memory? You're smiling now, just a little, because these stories are so perfectly strange, not terrifying, just odd enough to raise a goosebump or two, like a cold draft in an empty hallway, or a light that flickers only once. And you can't help but think of how something as simple as a child's reflection could become part of such a tangled web of rituals and rules. By the end of the Georgian era, more and more households began to phase out mirrors in children's rooms, not because of fear, but because of fashion. Wallpaper grew busier, toys became more elaborate, and the belief in reflective self-awareness began to fall out of favor. But the old rules lingered, quietly passed down like lullabies sung half asleep. Don't let a baby cry in front of a mirror. Don't leave a toddler alone with one after dark. And if a child whispers to her reflection, listen carefully. You might learn something. You feel the hush deepen now, like the air itself is leaning in to listen. Outside, the wind has quieted. The soft pulse of your heartbeat folds into the shadows, and the tale flows on, this time into the private world of the Georgian boudoir, where mirrors weren't just tools, they were companions, witnesses, sometimes even rivals. You're in a lady's dressing room now, not some vast gilded palace chamber, but a smaller velvet-lined space just off the bedroom. There's a 3-paneled mirror on the dressing table, the kind that folds like wings. Its brass hinges creak faintly as the house settles. Beside it, perfumes, powders, and a comb with loose silver strands still curled in its teeth. These mirrors had names, not officially, but privately. A lady might say, "I'll ask Henrietta what she thinks," while trying on a hat, or "I caught Eleanor giving me a sour look this morning." They weren't speaking to themselves exactly. They were speaking to her, the version of themselves behind the glass. This wasn't madness. It was routine. After all, if you spend hours each day grooming, arranging, adjusting, wouldn't you start to suspect the face looking back has thoughts of its own? One duchess allegedly kept a diary of her mirror's expressions: smug on Mondays, encouraging on Fridays, sulky whenever her cousin visited. Her maid swore the duchess's mood followed the mirror's lead, not the other way around. Historians still argue whether this kind of personification reflected genuine belief or just theatrical eccentricity. Maybe it was both. Georgian aristocrats had time to invent new habits, especially the kind that let them remain the center of a tiny, well-framed world. But the tension grew at night. Ladies were instructed to cover their mirrors before bed, not just for superstition, but to protect the soul from dispersal. As one etiquette book dramatically phrased it, the belief was that a mirror left exposed might continue to reflect after the room went dark, and in doing so, it could release stray energies or invite others in. Others being, well, that depended on the household. Some believed they were spirits. Some thought they were thoughts given form. Others whispered about mirror folk, shadow versions of oneself who became stronger the more you looked. A fringe detail here: in 1782, a minor noblewoman named Lady Isidora Vexley claimed her reflection began to age out of sync. She described seeing wrinkles in the mirror that weren't on her actual skin, not subtle ones, deep branching lines across her neck and cheeks. She insisted they vanished the moment she blinked. Her letters describe it all in calm, rational detail. She even sketched the mirrored version of her own face. Strangely enough, her niece claimed that after Lady Isidora's death, the same dressing mirror cracked in 3 clean lines without being touched. Coincidence, sure, but odd all the same. By the late 1700s, ladies began developing habits that bordered on ritual. 3 passes of the brush before meeting the gaze, powder applied with eyes closed, and never looking directly into the mirror when whispering to oneself. Because sometimes the reflection moved its lips too. There's a story from Bath, from a young widow who set her mirror in the hallway outside her dressing room door. She didn't explain. She just said it was too interested lately. Her maid, a wiry girl with strong opinions, claimed she caught the reflection peering in at the wrong angle, showing the hallway before the widow even opened the door. Is it possible the glass was warped? Of course, it's always possible, but when you hear enough of these stories, that excuse starts to feel lazy. Here's the thing, in daylight, everything made sense, but after candle snuffing time, when corsets hung like ghosts from hooks and slippers were tucked into shadowy corners, the mirror became the last thing a woman saw before sleep. And sometimes that was the problem. You're lying back now, maybe even catching yourself blinking slower. Imagine her, this Georgian woman, corset loosened, hair down, cheeks wiped clean of powder. She gazes into the mirror and she wonders, is that how others see me? Is that how he saw me? Will I still be beautiful tomorrow? And somewhere deep in the quiet curve of her mind, she wonders something else. What if this version of me goes on thinking, even after I walk away? Modern scholars refer to this as self-duality anxiety, the fear of the double, the awareness that there's a version of you you cannot control and it might outlive your presence. Most people forget this fear when they age. Georgian women, they made it fashionable. There were, of course, debates among beauty writers. Some insisted that long gazes into the mirror improved one's posture and confidence. Others warned that too much reflection encouraged vanity, or worse, introspection. And in an age where conformity was prized, thinking too much about yourself was practically a rebellion. One quirky invention, the mirror hood, a little silk bonnet not for the lady, but for the mirror, worn at night like a sleeping cap, tied under the sconce to keep it secure, popular for about 2 years until it was declared twee and ridiculous by a snobbish column in the Gentlewoman's Gazette. You exhale now, warm and slow. It's peaceful here, isn't it? Knowing you can pull away from your reflection whenever you like, that the glass stays quiet, that your thoughts are your own. But for a Georgian lady, the mirror knew too much, saw too much, held too many versions of her, caught at odd angles between romance and regret. And every night, as she reached for the cloth to drape over the glass, she'd do it with the same thought. Let me sleep as only one person tonight, not two. The hour creeps later, the shadows smooth themselves against the walls, and you, tucked in, soft beneath the weight of quiet, are drifting deeper into the folds of Georgian life. Tonight, we cross the line between superstition and performance, because while mirrors haunted bedrooms and nurseries, they also took center stage in a most peculiar pastime, the midnight parlor game. You arrive just as the guests are giggling. A handful of young ladies, corsets half loosened, hairpins slipping, gather around a tall standing mirror by candlelight. They've been dared, of course. That's how these things start. After the waltzes, after the syllabub, after the footmen yawn in corners, a game to stir the blood. It's called mirror gazing, or, if they're feeling dramatic, summoning the beloved. The idea? At midnight, you light a candle, stare into a mirror alone, and walk backward down a hallway, or sometimes up a staircase. If you do it just right, you'll see the face of your future husband appear over your shoulder. Perfectly harmless, except for all the ways it wasn't. Because while the goal was courtship, what often came instead was something else. Reports from the period mention girls fainting after glimpsing a skull, a black veil, or a face that wasn't their own. One tale from a Wiltshire estate describes a girl who laughed so hard at the absurdity of it all that her reflection kept laughing long after she'd gone still. Of course, it could be hysteria, or candlelight, or boredom curdling into suggestion, but historians still argue whether this parlor ritual was ever just a game, or if it masked deeper anxieties about marriage, identity, and the fear of vanishing into someone else's life. And yes, the ritual came with rules. The mirror had to be unclouded, the candle unscented, no one could be watching. You had to speak the phrase, "Let me see him only once," or else risk inviting the wrong one. Who the wrong one was, that part changed. Some versions said it was a stranger's soul, adrift and lonely, eager for contact. Others believed it was your own reflection grown sentient, annoyed you only visited during silly games. The most dramatic version? That your future husband would appear if he was living. But if not, if he was already fated to die before the wedding, then you'd see a coffin, or worse, nothing at all. There's a fringe account in an obscure household manual from 1797 that warns, quite plainly, the mirror is not a door, but it remembers every knock, which feels like advice that comes after something's gone wrong. And it did go wrong, occasionally. In one notorious case, a baronet's daughter locked herself in the drawing room to attempt the ritual alone. She was found hours later, candle burned to a stub, having scratched a circle around the mirror on the floor with a hairpin. When asked what she saw, she reportedly whispered, "He was already standing there." But not every attempt ended in dread. Sometimes a girl would see a warm blur, a suggestion of a shoulder, the tilt of a chin, enough to giggle over with her friends, enough to pretend for one thrilling evening that destiny had a face. And for those who saw nothing, well, they often tried again next week, or swore off marriage altogether and adopted a cat. Both solid options, really. But here's where it gets stranger. In some households, mirror gazing wasn't just for young ladies. Older women, widows, spinsters, even housekeepers, were known to perform private rituals, though they rarely admitted it. One curious record describes a chambermaid who placed a silver coin between her teeth and gazed into a darkened mirror to see where her luck had wandered. Another wrote down the names of her lost friends on scraps of paper, folded them, and set them in front of the mirror to see which name the flame leaned toward. It wasn't just about love anymore, it was about contact, memory, closure. Mirrors had become stage and seance, dream and diary. Modern psychologists have a name for what sometimes happens when you stare into your own reflection for too long under low light. It's called the strange face illusion. Your brain begins to misfire, expecting change, and so it supplies one. You might see your face warp, melt, darken. You might see someone else entirely. You might think that's a recent discovery. But Georgian ladies knew, not with science maybe, but with instinct. They knew that to look too long was to invite something, so they made a game of it. Disguise the ritual with laughter. Pretend the fear is flirtation. Tell yourself it's just a joke. Even when the air shifts and the candle sputters and your reflection begins to frown a second too soon. One fringe belief claimed that mirrors had moods and would only reveal the future if you first calmed them with perfume or music. In several households, women sang softly before beginning the ritual. One reportedly offered compliments. "You're very clear tonight, she'd coo, much more elegant than yesterday," which, let's be honest, is no weirder than half the things we do today before opening a dating app. You smile now, drifting between stories, your eyelids heavier with each strange little detail. There's something oddly comforting in knowing how long humans have tried to peer forward, how often we've hoped that glass might tell us who's coming, who's staying, who we might become. But the mirror never speaks. It only listens, reflects, waits. And if you're lucky, that's all it ever does. You shift beneath the covers, just slightly. The room feels quieter now, as if the very air has sunk deeper into the night. We're still inside that Georgian house, its walls breathing with old secrets and faint candle soot. But now, your path curves away from the ladies' parlor and drifts down the hallway, toward the nursery. Children and mirrors, a risky pairing. You tiptoe in, careful not to wake the slumbering dolls. A rattle lies on the rug, a curtain lifts ever so gently in the breeze, and in the far corner, where shadow pools behind the toy chest, there stands a mirror, not a large one and not quite full length, about child height, framed in painted wood, its edges smudged with tiny fingerprints. Here's the odd part. No one really remembers buying that mirror. At least, that's what one mother wrote in a diary from 1793. She'd noticed her daughter speaking quietly into the corner of the room each morning, giggling at jokes no one else could hear. When asked, the child only said, "She's already awake in the glass." Children were often thought to be closer to the veil between worlds, more sensitive, more honest, more vulnerable. Georgian parents would sometimes remove mirrors entirely from nurseries, not out of decor concerns, but fear. The belief was that a child might accidentally bond with their reflection too deeply, or worse, confuse it for someone else entirely. This wasn't just upper crust paranoia. Folklore across rural England and Scotland repeated the warning: don't let a child see their reflection before they can walk. Why? Because it might encourage the soul to stay in the mirror instead of inside the body. Some midwives even went so far as to cover mirrors during labor, lest the child's first sight be its own double. One fringe anecdote from a Devonshire estate tells of a toddler who refused to answer to her name unless it was spoken while standing near the mirror. Her nursemaid claimed the child believed she only existed properly in the glass. Modern developmental psychologists might roll their eyes and talk about self-recognition, milestones, and ego formation, but even they admit something changes the first time a child recognizes themselves. Before that, the mirror is just motion. After, it's identity. And in Georgian times, identity came with rules. A child who gazed too long at her own reflection was warned she'd grow up vain, selfish, or consumed by airs. But there was another fear beneath that, a deeper one, that she might grow up strange. Not all mirror tales from the nursery were dark. Some children reportedly told stories about their mirror friend helping them sleep. "She sang me the backward song," said one boy sleepily, or "he waved even after I stopped waving." Mostly, adults dismissed these accounts with fond indulgence, but not always. One lady, known only by her initials, MF, wrote a series of letters to her sister detailing her growing concern over her son's reflection. She said it began to move too quickly, then too slowly. Sometimes it copied him perfectly. Other times, it lagged behind, as though distracted. Her final letter ends with the line, "I've taken down the glass, but I swear I still hear it blink." You swallow slowly. No rush, just a little nudge of unease to nestle into. There were countermeasures, of course. Some families gifted children safety mirrors, mirrors intentionally clouded, distorted, or cut into playful shapes to keep them from forming too much attachment to a single clear reflection. A rabbit-shaped mirror, a mirror surrounded by painted cherubs, anything to make it seem less like a doorway. There's also the curious practice of mirror bathing. No, not with water. Georgian mothers were advised to introduce children to mirrors gradually, first at a distance, then briefly, then while holding the child's hand, so they know which side they truly belong to, one guide explains. Historians still argue whether this was rooted in spiritual concern or simply early forms of child psychology. It's hard to separate belief from behavior when the stakes are that visceral. A child's soul worth being a little overprotective. And then there's the tale of the whistling mirror. This one's barely a whisper in the records, but it crops up in 2 letters from different counties. Both describe a mirror that emitted a faint sound, like a soft whistle or wind through reeds, only when a child stood in front of it alone. One nurse claimed it was the sound of the mirror calling back. There are no follow-up entries, just that single mention, like a breath before silence. Of course, today we have no patience for such ideas. We call it pareidolia, light tricks, HVAC noises. Children have vivid imaginations, but then so did Georgian adults, and they had far fewer distractions. A dark room, a silent house, a child muttering to her mirror is enough to raise the hairs on anyone's neck, even yours. And yet, you feel no urgency now, only stillness, that drowsy heaviness behind your eyes, because the mirror isn't looking at you, it's looking with you. Remember, the mirror doesn't care what age you are, but children, they see through it faster. They aren't burdened by reason. They haven't yet learned to distrust what doesn't make sense. To them, the mirror might just be a friend. And maybe, on the right night, with the right hush, that friend waves back. The house is near silent now. Not the kind of silence that comes from absence, but the kind that feels expectant. The nursery door clicks shut behind you. Candles are stubs. The halls stretch longer than before. Somewhere in the dark, a grandfather clock wheezes its way toward the hour. But you're not scared. Not really. Just aware that we've slipped into the part of the night the Georgians called thin, when things feel looser, less locked in place. Even your thoughts. You follow a narrow hallway that leads to the servant quarters, tucked away, always half a staircase removed from polite society. The walls here are plain, chipped, whispering with echoes. And here, too, there are mirrors, but not the grand kind. These are fragments, shards, bits of reflection tucked into corners or nailed above wash basins. And what a world they saw. Servants lived by their own rules, but they weren't immune to superstition. In fact, they often carried their own folklore, stitched together from generations of whispered warnings and half-remembered tales. Among them was one particular belief: mirrors borrow more than just light. There's a letter written by a footman named Thomas in 1782. He'd grown convinced the cracked mirror in his quarters showed too much. Claimed he saw his room from a different angle when he glanced sideways, not a reflection, more like a second version, one where the bed was unmade or the boots were already by the door, despite still being on his feet. He wrote, "It knows what I haven't done yet," and he wasn't the only one. Chambermaids sometimes draped mirrors, not only during storms or deaths, but while telling secrets, not because they feared ghosts, but because they believed mirrors remembered words. One superstition claimed that a mirror could hold a grudge if you spoke ill of someone while looking into it. Some even knocked softly on the frame afterward, like a tiny apology. You might think this is all a bit much, but think about how often these mirrors saw things their owners never did. Hidden glances, midnight tears, a servant moving through the master's room, fixing the collar of a coat, catching their own eyes in the glass. Over time, it starts to feel like the mirror knows you better than anyone else, or perhaps remembers you better. One fringe belief held that a mirror, when left unwashed too long, could ferment with emotion. Some even claimed the glass would grow heavier, not physically, but emotionally. You could feel it leaning, one account says. A maid from Lincolnshire wrote that she once saw her face frown in the mirror before she had the chance to. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were coping mechanisms, ways to explain exhaustion, grief, or the eerie loneliness of servitude. But others suspect the servants, spending long hours alone with these objects, may have simply seen more than anyone else. And so rituals formed. A broom tapped against the frame to clear old energy. A whispered prayer before cleaning the glass. Even passing a hand over it clockwise 3 times after moving house. Small things, quiet gestures, but consistent. There's something deeply human about that, isn't there? The urge to make peace with objects that watch, to reassure the mirror that you mean no harm, that you're grateful for the reflection. Of course, not all mirror beliefs were ominous. One curious tradition among kitchen staff was the sweet tooth mirror, a tiny, round mirror kept in the spice cupboard. If you whispered your craving into it, say, for ginger biscuits or lemon tart, and then looked away, it was said the cook might feel a sudden urge to make that very dish later in the day. Coincidence, maybe, or just an excuse to talk to yourself without judgment. But charming nonetheless. Contrast that with the salt mirror. This one was far more serious. A mirror kept above a fireplace, rimmed with a thin line of salt, was said to block evil intent. Not magic necessarily, just envy, malice, the silent, bitter thoughts people think but never speak aloud. It was believed the salt would absorb those energies, and the mirror would reflect them outward, sending the ugliness back where it came from. One story describes a butler who insisted the salt line be replaced weekly. When asked why, he only said, "It cracked once, and so did the lady of the house. I won't let it happen again." You linger on that thought. Cracks in mirrors were considered particularly dangerous, not just because of bad luck, but because they were thought to invite in confusion. A crack could become a gap, a portal, or, as one pamphlet warned, a split in the story of the self. And that's what these mirrors really were for the servants, a place to glimpse who they were becoming when no one else was watching. Some said if you stared too long, you'd start to see not just yourself, but your future job. You'd see yourself in finer clothes or none at all, sometimes smiling, sometimes crying. One eerie tale tells of a maid who saw herself in the mirror dressed as a bride. Weeks before she was dismissed and married off to a chimney sweep, she claimed it was a blessing. Others weren't so sure. You blink, heavy now, thoughts drifting like coal dust through an old estate corridor. Because in this house, in this time, the servants' mirrors carried a different kind of magic. Not flashy, not dramatic, but observant, patient, present. And maybe when the upper floors were too busy performing, the lower mirrors caught the truth instead. The air thickens with candle smoke and age as you descend again, this time not downstairs, but deeper into atmosphere. You can feel the weight of hours pressing into the walls. There's barely a sound, save for the creak of an old floorboard and the occasional pop of settling wood. You pass what used to be a side salon, then a forgotten study, and eventually come to a narrow room that doesn't seem to belong. It's a mirror room, not the elegant Versailles type you might be imagining. No chandeliers or polished floors. This one's intimate, dusty, lined with mismatched looking glasses, oval, square, warped, none of them quite the same. Some too low to be practical, others hung so high you'd have to crane your neck to see yourself. And in the low, flickering light, they all shimmer slightly, as if not entirely sure they want to reflect you. This was a curiosity space, the kind some Georgian houses kept for entertainment or quiet ritual. But this one seems different, quieter, more deliberate, and it tells a story you're not quite ready for. But we're here, so let's lean in. The Georgians, you see, had a complicated relationship with identity. Class was a costume. Manners were rehearsed. Mirrors weren't just furniture. They were tools for maintenance. But when one spent too long alone with a mirror, the polished self began to crack, which is where the mirror diary comes in. Yes, it was a thing. Some households, especially those of philosophical or eccentric leanings, encouraged young ladies to keep reflections of reflection, not in writing, not in speech, but by standing before a mirror for precisely 5 minutes each evening and silently observing the changes. No emotions allowed, just notice. Was your brow tighter today? Were your eyes softer? Did your posture falter when no one was looking? One baronet's daughter confessed in a letter that she'd grown addicted to this practice. "I watch myself disappear into the looking glass," she wrote. "Each night I lose a little more." That's not exactly a bedtime thought, but it tells us something about the power of observation, especially self-observation. Georgian culture encouraged presentation, but also modesty. To stare too long at one's own image was considered both arrogant and risky, because what if the mirror saw through the act? A curious pamphlet from 1769, titled "The Vice of Glasses," warned against the mirrored self-idolatry of aristocratic women. But it wasn't a sermon on pride, it was a warning that one could begin to believe the version of the self reflected back, even when it lied, or worse, when it didn't. The room you're in now might have been used for such exercises, or perhaps it was part of a private philosophical ritual. Some fringe thinkers of the era believed mirrors were ideal tools for self-correction. You couldn't argue with what you saw. You couldn't explain away your own hesitation, your own insincerity. One popular idea of the time was mirrored contradiction, a kind of visual journaling. You try to smile at the mirror while thinking about something upsetting, and vice versa. The belief was that your reflection would reveal the truth of your inner state. In some circles, it was even thought that a mirror could warn you of mental instability long before symptoms appeared. Historians still debate whether these beliefs were early, flawed attempts at self-therapy or just elaborate metaphors, But what's certain is that many Georgians feared one thing above all, recognizing themselves too well. And now you're here, surrounded by these slightly warped glass panes, noticing the way they all hold you differently. One reflection makes your shoulders seem straighter, another deepens the hollows beneath your eyes, and one, you could swear, makes you look like you're leaning, even though you're standing still. It's a strange kind of intimacy, standing with yourself under a mirror's gaze, unlike a portrait, which flatters, or a shadow, which only follows. The mirror replicates, but never perfectly. You're always a beat behind, a hair askew, your expression caught mid-thought, and sometimes you blink too late. There's a Georgian rumor, faint and folkloric, that if your reflection ever blinks after you do, you must cover the mirror immediately and leave the room backward, never turning your back to the glass. Why backward? To avoid showing the mirror your vulnerable side, the part of you that doesn't know what's coming. Another odd tidbit? Some women carried miniature mirrors not to check their appearance, but to discreetly monitor their own emotional stability. A pale cheek, a too quick glance, a twitch near the eye, all signs that the nerves are askew, wrote one etiquette advisor. These were pre-psychology days, when emotion was both feared and prized, and mirrors were a diagnostic tool in the most fragile human sense. In one preserved diary, a noble woman wrote of feeling as if my reflection were gently waiting to take over. She stopped using mirrors entirely for a time, relying on her maid's descriptions to get dressed. It wasn't madness, it was a kind of retreat, a silent war between self-image and self-awareness. And maybe in that echo chamber of watching and being watched, she glimpsed a truth she couldn't unsee. We're deep now, aren't we? But let your mind soften a little. Let the glass blur. Let the reflections lose their edge. They're only fragments after all. They only show what they're told. It's you who fills in the gaps. In this house, this mirror room, time is slower. You feel it, like syrup or velvet. Nothing sharp here, just the gentle pressure of centuries worth of gazes, all trying to understand who they were. And maybe, if you stare just long enough, you'll see someone who isn't trying anymore. Someone simply being. You step out of the mirror room gently, as if your footsteps might still echo within those panes. The hallway greets you with a hush, and something inside you has quieted too. It's not fear exactly. It's more like awareness has curled itself into a small, sleepy knot somewhere near your ribs. The house is still, but not stagnant. You can almost hear its breath, the tick of a far-off clock, the rustle of ivy against old glass. You follow a corridor that angles slightly, uneven beneath your feet, until it deposits you into what was once a music room. Here, the mirrors have migrated upward. High above the harpsichord and faded music stands, the ceiling is lined with mirrored panels, not full reflections, but fragments, pieces that catch only slices of you, an elbow, a cheekbone, the top of your head. The effect is disorienting, but beautiful. This space was designed for evening entertainments, recitals, poetry readings, delicate little scandals whispered between verses. Georgian society adored theatrics, not just plays, but the performance of daily life, the graceful reach for a teacup, the precise flutter of a fan, the timed glance toward a rival, and mirrors were part of the script. There's a niche belief, still debated by historians, that these mirrored ceilings weren't just ornamental. They were, in some circles, a way of observing social harmony. Guests would appear both on the floor and in the ceiling, giving hosts a double view of interactions, flirtations, faux pas. Was someone ignoring their dance partner? Was a guest leaving too early or staying too long near the port decanter? You might catch it not in person, but in the mirror above. One dowager countess reportedly called her ceiling my second set of eyes. There's a certain poetry to that. A house watching itself, a mirror keeping an eye on the drama without ever blinking. And if that isn't peak Georgian, I don't know what is. But of course, there was also fear, because while mirrors could reflect performance, they could also reveal failure. In households where reputation was everything, even the smallest crack in social grace could spiral into scandal. A whispered insult, a drunken stumble, a too honest laugh. People feared that if the wrong moment were caught in the wrong mirror, it might echo outward, reflected not once, but a dozen times, bouncing from glass to glass until the whole house knew. One particularly strange practice emerged from this fear: mirror shrouding during arguments. Yes, if a couple began to quarrel, they might discreetly drape the room's mirrors in cloth before continuing. The idea that conflict should not be seen, not even by inanimate objects, because once seen, it might be remembered. A fringe theory, especially among theatrical circles, suggested mirrors didn't just reflect the scene, they absorbed the emotion. That laughter could linger, that rage could leave a residue. One eccentric dramatist even refused to rehearse in mirrored spaces, claiming they drank the energy of the room like punch. Silly? Perhaps, but think about it. You've walked past mirrors after crying, haven't you? And maybe just for a second, you wondered if your reflection looked a little too knowing, like it had been waiting for this. Georgian actors, too, had their rituals. Some refused to look at their reflection before a performance, not out of vanity, but to keep the character clean. They worried that glimpsing their real self would pollute the illusion. A few even practiced in darkened mirrors, training themselves to feel without watching. One diary entry from a stage manager notes, "Miss Alders refused the looking glass again today, said it lies, but better a lie she chooses than one she sees too late." You sit on the edge of a faded settee now, beneath those fragmented reflections above. They shimmer faintly, catching only part of you. There's comfort in that, a reminder that no mirror ever captures the whole truth, not of a person, not of a moment, just slices. And maybe that's enough. One last story, if you can stay awake for it. It's about a Georgian ball, one of those grand, glittering affairs with powdered wigs and endless minuets. But this one had a twist. The host, an eccentric marquis with a flair for theatrical cruelty, placed a large standing mirror at the end of the ballroom and told each guest to bow before it at the end of the night. Politeness demanded compliance, so one by one guests approached the mirror, curtsied or bowed, and then stood in silence as their reflection looked back. But the lighting was dim, the guests were tired. Some swore later, quietly, that their reflection did not match, that they moved a second too early or too late, that they saw themselves turning away before they actually did. One young lady fainted on the spot. Of course, the official record says the mirror was merely angled slightly forward, creating an illusion of depth and delay, a harmless trick. But the lady never attended another ball. Historians still argue whether this tale is true, exaggerated, or wholly apocryphal. But the story stuck. The idea that in the middle of your most dazzling moment, a mirror might betray you, show the audience the wrong version of you. And if that's not an anxiety dream in corset form, I don't know what is. You lie back now, gaze softening upward, letting those mirrored ceiling panels distort and blend into one another. Let the drama fade. Let the performance unwind. You've played your part well tonight. The mirrors have seen it, and they will keep your secrets. Probably. You rise from the settee like smoke curling upward, slow, unhurried, as if the room itself has decided not to notice. Back into the hallway now, where everything feels just a touch quieter, the kind of silence that settles only after long reflection, like a ballroom hours after the last guest has gone. Your fingers graze the wallpaper as you walk, and you notice a faint change in temperature, cooler, closer to the edge of something. You follow it, letting instinct lead until you find yourself standing before a set of double doors, carved with delicate filigree and softened by age. Behind them, a private dressing chamber, perhaps the most intimate room in the entire house. You step inside. There's no grand furniture here, just a simple vanity, a few armchairs, and 3 tall mirrors angled carefully around a central stool. This is where things got personal, not for guests, not for performance. This was the space where Georgian ladies prepared to face the world, or themselves. The dressing room was the domain of transformation. Corsets, creams, powders, perfumes. Entire mornings could be spent layering identity like lacquer. And mirrors were not luxuries, they were necessities, often 3 at a time, to ensure no angle went unconsidered. But here's the twist. Georgian beauty rituals were less about allure and more about composure. A perfectly powdered face didn't just signal wealth, it signaled control. A calm brow, a placid mouth, no rogue expressions that might betray fatigue or inner turmoil. The mirror was your checkpoint. It asked, "Are you ready to perform?" One surviving beauty manual from 1784 advised women to study thy reflection, not for vanity, but for strategy. That's not quite a slogan for Sephora, but the message was clear. Your mirror wasn't for flattery. It was your front line in the war of social survival. And so, in this room, where the air still faintly carries traces of lavender water and beeswax pomade, you start to feel the pressure. Not yours, but hers. The woman who sat here nightly, removing her mask layer by layer until she wasn't quite sure which version of herself remained beneath it. We know of one such woman. Her name was Lady Helena Broughton, and she was, depending on who you ask, a socialite, a recluse, a visionary, or completely mad. What we do know is that she ordered a set of custom mirrors for her dressing chamber, designed to never reflect precisely the same image twice. The mechanism was subtle, panels behind the glass that shifted minutely over time, bending the light just enough to alter perception. A smile might look brighter one day, a gaze more uncertain the next. It was less science and more psychological sabotage. Why? According to her correspondence with a friend, she believed a mirror's honesty should be tempered with mercy. That too much truth, too directly delivered, was corrosive, so she created a mirror that lied a little, or perhaps one that comforted. Quirky? Undeniably. But the idea stuck. It sparked a short-lived trend in private circles. Soft mirrors, crafted with imperfections, designed to gently blur reality. Some claimed it reduced anxiety. Others said it made things worse. Historians still argue whether Lady Helena was protecting herself from the truth, or from something else entirely. Because this was also the room where, according to household staff, the mirrors were covered after midnight, not the whole house. Just here, just in this space. You can picture it, can't you? The candlelit hush, the dimming of lamplight, and then, ritualistically, the silk cloths drawn over the glass. No reflections after 12, no catching your own gaze in that in-between hour when everything feels slightly unmoored. One maid recalled being scolded for dusting the mirror too late at night. She said it stirs things, the girl wrote, said the looking glass grows greedy after dark. Weirdly poetic, right? But it lines up with other Georgian superstitions. Midnight wasn't just a time, it was a threshold, a seam in the fabric of the day where boundaries soften between sleep and wakefulness, between who you are and who you fear becoming. In a house so obsessed with image, that moment of transition was a threat. And so the covering stayed. You look at the mirrors now, their surfaces dulled by age, but still faintly reflective, just enough to hint at your outline. And for a moment, you wonder what the glass remembers, not just faces, but thoughts, glances, hesitations, every time someone flinched at their own reflection, every time someone mouthed a secret to the mirror, hoping it wouldn't answer back. Because here's the quiet truth. Mirrors are only scary if you think they might show something you've been trying to ignore. A flaw in the facade, a flicker of doubt, a version of you that isn't curated or contained. Lady Helena might have been eccentric, but maybe she understood something deeper. That sometimes the kindest thing a mirror can do is look away. You sit at the stool now, just briefly, and let your gaze settle on the center mirror. You're not checking your hair. You're not adjusting your collar. You're just being. And in the dim, sleepy light, the reflection doesn't startle. It doesn't smirk. It simply waits, soft, honest, a little blurred, like everything at this hour should be. Let the room hold that moment. No corrections, no questions, just the hush of centuries and the ghost of a powder puff still resting on the vanity. You rise just as quietly as you came, and the mirror, if it notices, says nothing. Back out into the corridor now, and you can feel it, that subtle shift in air, in weight. You've come to the edge of something. Not a cliff, not a danger, just the farthest point in a long, drifting dream. This house of mirrors has given you its stories, but there's one last room, one final sigh before the silence, the attic. Of course it's the attic. Where else do you hide things you're not sure how to let go of? You take the narrow stairway slowly. Each creaking step feels less like sound and more like breath, a long exhale from the old wood beneath your feet. At the top, the door isn't locked, just swollen with time. You lean into it, and it opens with the faintest resistance, like it's asking, "Are you sure?" You are. The attic smells like linen and dust and quiet, a forgotten kind of quiet. No music, no footsteps, no powdered wigs brushing past one another in genteel conversation, just the slow crawl of sunlight through warped glass. And the mirrors, so many mirrors, leaning against rafters, wrapped in moth-eaten sheets, some cracked, some whole, some framed in ornate gold leaf that's turned ashy with age, others bare, their edges chipped like broken teacups. This was where the mirrors went when they were no longer welcome downstairs. Not destroyed, heaven forbid. No, you don't destroy mirrors in a house like this. You retire them, like tired performers who've forgotten their lines or whispered too much. Some of them, the old journals say, were considered too responsive. That's the phrase they use. Not cursed, not haunted, just responsive. They were said to hold on to moments, to reflect not just the present, but a little of what had come before. You look into one now, and you think, maybe it flickers, just a blink of someone else's posture, a shadow of a lace sleeve, a powdered nose adjusting itself, gone before you can be sure. Of course, that could just be your eyes. You're tired. A fringe rumor from 1806 claimed that one of these attic mirrors had once shown a woman's reflection smiling back even when she wasn't. The servant who noticed it quit the next day. No one could replicate the effect, and the mirror was promptly covered and moved up here. Historians still argue whether that story is true or if it was just another cautionary tale in the ever-growing library of Georgian moral horror. But the idea lingered. Mirrors as liars, mirrors as storytellers, mirrors as memory keepers. In the attic, they no longer serve. They simply are. You walk between them now, careful not to touch the glass. Just observe. In one corner, a full-length mirror stands uncovered. The glass has fogged slightly with age, giving everything a softened edge. You move closer, not out of vanity, but curiosity. Your reflection waits, but just behind your own image, barely perceptible, is the faintest outline of something else. Not threatening, just older. A trick of light or of memory? It doesn't matter. You've learned by now not to chase it. This isn't a movie. There's no jump scare, just the hush, the weight of time, the mirrors reflecting what they've always reflected, what we bring to them. You kneel beside a covered one now, and your fingers gently lift the edge of the fabric. The mirror beneath is cracked diagonally, but intact enough to show you half your face. The crack runs through your eye. You blink. Still you, still here, and that really is the heart of it all. Georgian ladies didn't fear mirrors because they were magic. Not really. They feared them because beneath all the pomp and powder, those mirrors knew things. They knew what happened in the gaps between formal poses. They caught the sighs after long nights. They remembered the eyes that watched too closely, the lips that trembled after too much silence. They were unblinking witnesses. And when midnight came, when the guests were gone and the corsets unlaced, those mirrors might show you not the person you performed, but the one you'd carefully hidden. So yes, they were covered, not to ward off spirits, but to preserve illusions, to grant a few hours of mercy, to stop asking questions you weren't ready to answer. You lean back against a wooden beam, the attic dust curling up in sleepy spirals around you. Somewhere below, the house has exhaled. It knows your footsteps now. You're breathing. It's letting you go. The mirrors remain, silent sentinels of long-vanished vanities, watching nothing in particular, watching everything all at once. Their stories are quiet now, but never empty. And as your eyes begin to close, the softest light shifts across the attic floor, like a curtain falling on the last act. Let yourself drift now. Let the attic dissolve. Let the mirrors blur back into glass and shadow, no longer sharp or knowing. The reflections no longer ask anything of you. They don't want your posture perfect or your emotions contained. They're content to sleep, just like you. The house grows distant. The wallpaper, the chandeliers, the rustling silks, they fade. Only the hush remains, the hush and the coolness of linen sheets that have never been folded, the quiet breath of time exhaling through forgotten keyholes. Even your footsteps grow softer until they are more suggestion than sound. The mirrors no longer shimmer. They don't flicker. They don't watch. They simply rest, like eyes gently closed after too many seasons spent open. You've wandered long enough. There are no more hidden corridors tonight, no more rituals to explain. You don't need to remember how to curtsy or which glance means disdain. You don't need to press your palms against the glass to check if you're real. You are, and you're safe here. Breathe slower now. Let your jaw unclench. Let your chest rise and fall like a calm tide. The world can wait. The performances can pause. For now is just the warmth of your own skin and the softness of not being observed. Even the mirrors know when to look away. Even the old stories know when to stop whispering. So sleep now. Let the last reflection fade with the dawn. Sweet dreams.